Hey guys, it's me, Dr. Ree, and in this video we're going to be talking about cranial nerves. Now, in the last lab, we did everything that had to do with the brain and spinal cord. Well, not every little thing, but the general things that you guys are responsible for knowing. And we're going to kind of extend out from that brain. This is part of the peripheral nervous system. Remember that the central nervous system was the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are the nerves that come out of either of those. The cranial nerves are what come out of the brain. And so we can see them all, we can see them all throughout here. These are all the cranial nerves, and we are going to be identifying all 12 cranial nerves. There are 12 sets of peripheral nerves, known as cranial nerves, that emerge out of the brain, and they innervate things that involve the head, the neck, the thorax, and the abdomen. So if we look at this image right here, if I were to just highlight, I like to do cranial nerves in. So right here, we have cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve. Right here, we have cranial nerve 2, which is the optic nerve. We have cranial nerve 3, oculomotor, cranial nerve 4, trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 5. See that it has 3 divisions of that 5. See how big 5 is? That is our trigeminal nerve. It's split into 3 different divisions: our ophthalmic, our maxillary, and our mandibular divisions. We have cranial nerve 6, our abducens nerve, cranial nerve 7, and cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 7 is facial, and cranial nerve 8 is vestibular cochlear. We can continue down here. We have cranial nerve, which one haven't I done? Cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 8, cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve 10, our vagus nerve, cranial nerve 11, our spinal accessory nerve, or accessory nerve, and then cranial nerve 12, our hypoglossal nerve. So there's a lot going on, okay, right? We have a lot of nerves there, and we are going to be defining them and kind of talking about the main purpose of each of these nerves. In lecture, you'll go into way more depth, but this is kind of just an intro into the 12 cranial nerves. So here you can see them identified on the image. So we have our olfactory cranial nerve 1, our oculomotor cranial nerve 2, cranial nerve 3. Here's optic, cranial nerve 2. I thought that line was going there straight down. It wasn't. There's oculomotor. Oculomotor is in the area of the midbrain. So these are midbrain areas. Remember that we had 3 parts of our brainstem: midbrain, pons, cerebellum, or medulla oblongata. Brain's not there right now. There's the trochlear and that trigeminal. That does break into 3 different. So that image is there. If you want to look at it more, just pause the video. But let's get into defining and summarizing the main ideas for each cranial nerve. So sometimes it's just hard to remember the names themselves of the cranial nerves, right? There's 12 of them. So if you are a Harry Potter fan, then this might help you remember, specifically if you watched from the 6th movie on. And kind of the little way to remember the 12 cranial nerves, at least the first letter of each of them, is on. They traveled and found Voldemort. I'm so bad with spelling. Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. Now, if you don't know Harry Potter and you have no idea what a Horcrux is, then I'm so sorry. This might not help you, and you'll have to come up with another one. But so on they traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. So let's talk about each of these. So cranial nerve 1, and when we write cranial nerve, you can abbreviate it CN. But when you do put the 1 or the 2 or the 3, you have to put it in Romeric or Roman numerals. So for 1, it looks like that. Cranial nerve 1 is our olfactory nerve. And the olfactory nerve, olfaction is the fancy way of saying smell. And so the olfactory nerve is going to do sensation of smell. So this would relate, it would go to the nose. And so it does sensory information. So that's cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is going to be responsible. Optic, remember we learned about the optic or the orbit, right? That's going to be the eye. So this is all about vision. And vision is a sense. So cranial nerve 2 is also going to be a sensory-based cranial nerve. Cranial nerves can be defined as sensory-based, a motor-based, or both motor and sensory. Kind of like when we talked about the different parts of the spinal nerve and that there were some regions that were sensory only, some regions that were motor only, and some that were both, which were the spinal nerves. That's kind of when I write sensory, motor, or both, that's what you're kind of getting there. So cranial nerve 2. Cranial nerve 3 is our oculomotor nerve. And the oculomotor, right, it kind of says it right there, is a motor-based. It does the movement, or it innervates the muscles of the eye, which allows the eye to move in different directions and see things. Oculo, right, again, we're thinking oculo is like the ocular region, and then motor. So the muscles that the oculomotor nerve supply are going to be all of the muscles besides the ones that are innervated by 2 other cranial nerves, which is trochlear and abducens. So we'll talk about the muscles. I'll write them out here once I introduce the other 2 nerves so that kind of can make sense. So this is motor. Our next one is one of those that also innervates the eye, and that's cranial nerve 4, abducens. And the abducens nerve is going to be responsible for innervating one muscle of the eye. And the muscle of the eye that it innervates is the superior oblique. So that would be a motor cranial nerve. I don't know if you can hear my dog snoring in the background, but that's what that sound is. The next cranial nerve is cranial nerve 5. Now, cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal, and the trigeminal has a whole lot going on. So the trigeminal does both sensory and motor. So it does sensation, it does pain and touch, so it does a lot of sensation for the face and the neck. So face, sinuses, teeth, all of that is all going through the trigeminal. And it also does, so I'm just going to say sensation of the head. So that includes feeling things, right, as well as pain. And it also does, so that would be a sensory idea. And it also does the motor to the muscles of mastication. Now, we learned about the muscles of mastication when we did our muscles use unit, mastication. And the muscles of mastication, there were 4 of them. We had our temporalis, our masseter, our lateral, and our medial pterygoid. So this also does motor, which means it does both. So the trigeminal nerve does both sensory and motor. There are 3 divisions because if you think about the face, right, here's my face. This one nerve has to do sensory for all of this. So the head is kind of then divided into a few subregions. So it kind of does kind of like this. And the 3 subdeletions, so trigeminal V1 is how you would V1 with a little 1. So you kind of see I put like a little 1 there. This would be the trigeminal 1, or would be our ophthalmic, which is our top one. V2 would be our maxillary. It's named because it's right kind of in the where the maxilla is, right underneath the eye. And V3 is the mandibular region, or the mandibular division, sorry. So these are the 3 divisions of the trigeminal. So that's cranial nerve 5. So that's a big nerve. Our next is cranial nerve 6, which is our abducens nerve. And our abducens nerve is going to also do motor for the muscle of the eye, a specific muscle of the eye, which is the lateral rectus. The lateral rectus is a muscle of the eye. And this does motor. So now I've defined 2 of those muscles of the eye, right? We have lateral rectus, superior oblique. Now I can name the muscles because oculomotor does all of the other ones. And so that would be our inferior oblique, our medial rectus, our superior rectus, and our inferior rectus. So those are the muscles that it does. So it does all of the other muscles besides these 2 muscles that the abducens and the, oops, sorry, I wrote abducens here and I meant to write trochlear. It's hard to write and talk at the same time, guys. Trochlear. Hopefully you saw that earlier and like realized I misspoke, but so those all supply the eye. All right. Next, let's go to cranial nerve 7, which is the facial nerve. The facial nerve does a bunch of stuff, but the main function of the facial nerve is going to be motor to the muscles of the face, so of facial expression. Those are all those muscles we learned. So I'm talking about zygomaticus, I'm talking about the buccinator, I'm talking about occipitofrontalis, or epicranius or frontalis or whatever you wanted to call it, right? So this is giving motor to all of those. And so you might have heard of something called Bell's palsy or facial palsy, and that is when there is an issue with this cranial nerve and it causes the half of the face that the cranial nerve is associated with to not be able to express their face or have facial expression. The other thing that it does is it does taste. It specifically does taste to the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. We'll talk about that there are 2 other things that do taste. So this is the first cranial nerve that is involved in taste. So this is a sorry. So this one has both motor as well as sensory. So it is a both nerve. Next is cranial nerve 8, which has 2 parts, vestibulocochlear vestibular cochlear nerve is going to be doing sending information for the vestibular system as well as for cochlear, like cochlear implants. You think of someone who is hard of hearing or deaf, and so cochlear means the ear or hearing. It's involved in the cochlea, which is part of that whole system. We'll talk a little bit more in the next lab when we do special senses. But so this is going to help with the vestibular system, helps with balance. And the cochlear is hearing. So vestibular cochlear helps with balance and hearing. And both of those are sensory ideas. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. After all of these, I would have written nerve. I just didn't for some of them. So glossopharyngeal, big thing, but glosso, thinking tongue, pharyngeal, thinking pharynx, which is at the back of the throat. So the glossopharyngeal is all about things in the mouth. So it does all of the sensation parts that you can think of for that. So it is going to do sensation for the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So this would be taste and sensation, so feeling things. Right, so this had anterior 2/3, this is doing the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. As well as sensation of the tonsils and the pharynx. Right, the name tells you where it's feeling stuff. But it also does a little bit of motor. It does the motor for the muscles in the pharynx, so the pharyngeal muscles. We did not talk about the pharyngeal muscles too much in our lab, but you might have talked about them in lecture. So this one does, again, both. Then we have cranial nerve 10, which is our vagus nerve, and you probably have heard of the vagus nerve because regulating the vagus nerve is kind of a big thing in pop culture, but also in general, it's really important. We'll talk about some of these cranial nerves are also interrelated with the autonomic nervous system. We'll get into that in our next lab, but that's where kind of the vagus nerve really gets its knowledge or like its popularity in the media about this specific cranial nerve and the importance of regulating it. But the vagus nerve is going to be doing motor and sensory for heart, for the heart, the lungs, the bronchi, the trachea, the larynx, the pharynx, the GI tract, the external ear, right? So it does a whole lot. So I'm just going to write, instead of writing all of this out, it's just the motor and sensory of the thorax and abdomen. So that's kind of a really easy way of writing all of those different things. So it does both. Cranial nerve 11, and so in Roman numerals, if you didn't know, if I'm going, sorry, I just wrote cranial nerve 9. So you can see cranial nerve 9 has the 1 in front of the 10, so that means 10 minus 1 is 9. Versus to write 11, you do the 10 plus 1, so you put the like 1 dash on the other side, just in case you confuse those two. And that is my accessory nerve. There are two parts of the accessory nerve. There is a cranial part and there is a spinal part. And so when we look at the cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve, the main thing we think about is that it's going to do motor, specifically motor to the SCM, sternocleidomastoid, and trapezius. And then our last cranial nerve, I know this is a lot, is cranial nerve 12. This is our hypoglossal nerve. And the hypoglossal nerve is going to be all about motor of the tongue. So motor. So that is the general. Now, There is so much more in-depth stuff we could go into each of these, but this is the general idea of what these nerves do. One thing I just realized as I was looking at this, the vagus nerve does do some sensation of the larynx for taste. We do a little bit of taste in the larynx area. So this does taste in the larynx. So in case a question asks what are the 3 nerves that involve taste, we have cranial nerve 7, 9, and 10. All right, so one common question is this nerve a sensory nerve, a motor nerve, or both? So I'm going to kind of color code them. So I'm going to do sensory in blue. So if it's sensory only, it's going to be blue. If it's motor only, it's going to be pink. And if it's both, it's going to be yellow. And there's like a little saying for that. So let me write out the little saying. And this is one that a lot of people have maybe heard before, is this mnemonic, just because I think it's a common one that a lot of people do. I learned this in high school. So it is, some say money matters most. It's so hard to speak and write it out. Some say money matters. But my brother says big brains matter most. Sorry, it's hard to talk and speak and type or write it at the same time. So if I were to do those colors, right? Some say money matters, but my brother says big brains matter most. So if I were to color the cranial nerves with the sense or the type that it is, so we start with cranial nerve 1, which is right here. Cranial nerve 2, optic, which is another sensory. Cranial nerve 3, oculomotor. Cranial nerve 4, trochlear. Cranial nerve 5, trigeminal. I know I'm saying these a lot. It's because me saying it more, hopefully it'll help you remember it. So that's why I keep repeating what they are. Cranial nerve 6 is another motor. Cranial nerve 7, facial, is a both. Cranial nerve 8, vestibular cochlear, is sensation. Cranial nerve 9, right? Cranial nerve 8, cranial nerve 9. Our glossopharyngeal is going to be, hold on, my pen's not registering. It doesn't want to register. Hello, cranial nerve 9. There it goes. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, both. Cranial nerve 10, vagus, both. Cranial nerve 11, our spinal accessory, is motor. And cranial nerve 12, hypoglossal, is motor as well. So that kind of is a color-coded version of that. The other thing that I want you to kind of look at is which region of the brainstem these are each coming out of. So if we talk about the different regions of the brainstem that they're all coming out of, the first 4, or we'll even just say the first 3, so you can see that here, these 3 are going to be in my midbrain region. Cranial nerves, and you can kind of see that here, right? Cranial nerves 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 7 and 8 are in kind of the area that's between the pons and the medulla. But these are all, we're going to be thinking about them as in the pontine region. Then cranial nerves 9 through 12 are in the medulla oblongata, or originate there. So those are some divisions that we can think of with them too. Now, the last little thing is, remember way back when we looked at the skull and we looked at the different things like foramen spinosum and foramen rotundum. Well, here they are. They're coming back for us, okay? So knowing where, because they have to get to the things that are outside of the skull, it's important to know where the cranial nerves exit. So my little way of remembering this, I'm going to write it out first. Because I can't speak at the same time. Hold on. I am in a mood for jugs. Okay. So, the little saying that can help you remember the exits for each of the cranial nerves is a little kind of rhyme. Come on, Sophia, 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 roll over, Sophia. I am in a mood for jugs, 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 hello. Now, again, please don't take offense to these. These are just easier ways to remember things. So if I were to go through each of them, so this is for cranial nerve, and you make sure you kind of tell yourself, I'm not going to write cranial nerve each time. I'm just going to write, this is for cranial nerve 1, our olfactory nerve, and that comes out of the cribriform plate. Cranial nerve 2, our optic nerve, is going to be coming out of our optic canal. Cranial nerve 3, our oculomotor. Cranial nerve 4, our trochlear. Cranial nerve 5, the division 1, which is the ophthalmic division, as well as cranial nerve 6, abducens, are all going to go out of the superior orbital foramen. And so all the ones that were Sophia go to the superior orbital foramen. Cranial nerve 5, trigeminal, the second division, so V2, which was the maxillary division. Right, ophthalmic, eye, underneath the eye we have our maxilla, so maxillary. That is going to go through foramen rotundum. Cranial nerve 5, the third division, which is known as our mandibular division, is going to go through the foramen ovale. We talked about cranial nerve 6, abducens, is also superior orbital fissure. Cranial nerve 7, hello. Cranial nerve 7, facial, and cranial nerve 8, vestibular cochlear, are going to go, you can kind of see here, whoops, thought that was the highlighter. IAM, that is going to stand for the internal acoustic, sometimes called auditory, meatus, which is often abbreviated IAM. So both of those are going to be the IAM. cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11 are all going to go through the jugular foramen. And then cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve, goes through the hypoglossal canal. Or foramen. I think it's a canal. And so you can see that here on this image, showing also just as a reminder of what bones each of those are on. Cribriform plate is on the ethmoid bone. We see foramen. The optic canal is in the sphenoid. The superior orbital fissure is going to be in the sphenoid. And we see our trigeminal that are going through our foramen rotundum and foramen ovale are also going to be in that sphenoid area. Temporal, right? That's where we're going to have our IAM. And then back here in our occipital, we see that we get our jugular and our hypoglossal. So those are the bones that are associated with each of them as well. And that is cranial nerves. Now I know that is a lot, but definitely watching this before lab will be really helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I can't wait to see you in lab.